Hey kids! Today we're talking about syphilis. As I'm sure we're all aware, history is fucking sick. History is disturbing, it is disgusting, but more importantly, it's real damn interesting. So I heard the term a few months ago, Renaissance zombies, and just recently I decided to look further into the term Renaissance zombies. As it turns out, the term Renaissance zombies is referring to syphilis-ridden individuals from way back in the day who walked around with infections so bad in their face that their flesh would literally fall off. So with that out of the way, my name is Trinity. Let's talk about some fucking STDs. Syphilis is a bacterial disease that is commonly spread by unprotected sex. Syphilis is associated with the morally corrupt, the promiscuous, the unclean. And all of that is really just a nice way of saying that syphilis is associated with people who like to fuck a lot and with a lot of people. Symptoms of syphilis in the beginning stages include, but are not limited to, fever, sores, rashes, lesions on the genitalia, and overall flu-like symptoms. Syphilis was often mistaken for another disease called leprosy because just like syphilis, it starts out with rashes, blisters, and fever. Symptoms do come and go, but without treatment, and prolonged syphilis will cause severe damage to the nervous system, can cause meningitis, can cause strokes, and can also cause dementia. A pregnant woman infected with syphilis can actually pass down the syphilis disease to their unborn child, and that child will be born with what is referred to as congenital syphilis. A person with prolonged syphilis can develop huge growths and rashes and holes all over their body that causes flesh to literally fall off of their body, giving them a zombie-like look. So the origin of syphilis is commonly broken down into two theories, the Colombian theory and the Pre-Columbian theory. The Colombian theory is the theory that Christopher Columbus and his crew brought syphilis back home to Italy with them after the voyage ended. In 1494-1495, the first recorded syphilis outbreak took place in Naples, Italy. It's believed that French troops entertained Italian women of the night, and the French took syphilis back home with them. The pre-Columbian theory is the theory that syphilis already existed in Europe as well as the rest of the world, but it was mistaken for leprosy. Skeletal remains with evidence of syphilis have been found in the Dominican Republic and Austria, and are dated years before Columbus ever went on his voyage. Many scientists argue that the European writers from 1303 who reported lepra outbreaks were clearly reporting on syphilis, but again, syphilis and leprosy were often mistaken for one another. Regardless of the origin of syphilis, syphilis was quickly spread throughout the world by the booming trading routes that were emerging. As soon as these trading routes exploded on the scene, syphilis exploded around the world. Sailors were spreading syphilis to anyone they came in sexual contact with while on these trading routes. Syphilis was very common in brothels. A lot of, but not all, women in these brothels were infected with syphilis, and that's because of the sailors coming from all over the world spreading it to them. Because syphilis was commonly found within brothels, a lot of religious people often thought that syphilis was a punishment for those who partook in immoral acts. Though the disease affected all classes, it was mainly the poor who were suffering the most. One of the main reasons that the poor suffered the most with syphilis was because a lot of poor women had no choice but to work the brothels. Society at the time tried really hard to push the narrative that syphilis was a disease that was associated with the morally bankrupt and the poor. However, they couldn't ignore the fact that the upper class were also being infected with syphilis because, let's not forget, somebody had to buy the services from the brothels. In the Renaissance, everybody was fucking, and they were nasty. They were real fucking nasty. And I would argue that people in the Renaissance era were a lot nastier than us in the 21st century, even with sex work normalized. But yeah, they tried really, really hard to pin syphilis on all these poor people and all the poor sex workers. But let's not forget, who the fuck was buying the sexual services, okay? Just saying. People in the Renaissance era that was infected with syphilis are commonly known as today as the Renaissance zombies. And the reason for this being because healthcare and basic hygiene during that time was so like not a thing. The symptoms of syphilis were getting so bad that, like I said earlier, people were developing growths and they were developing huge holes like all over their face, their body, and flesh would fall off, and it would make them look like zombies. People's faces were falling off, a lot of people's noses were falling off, and it actually introduced a market for artificial noses. People were trying to mask the fact that they were ill with syphilis by getting artificial noses, and this actually laid down the foreground for what's known as reconstructive surgery today. By 1943, penicillin had already been discovered, and it was used as a cure for syphilis. Even with the boom of antibiotics at that time, there were still many corrupt scientists who liked to use unwilling participants to learn more about the disease. There was a Japanese biological and chemical warfare research development team known as Unit 731. Unit 731 started engaging in lethal human experiments. This alone could be an entire video by itself. I didn't have time to go further in depth on it. I really was like, when I was looking for this, obviously I was only really researching syphilis, but I learned a couple other really cool things. I didn't really pay attention in school, guys, and it's showing really hard right now. Anyways, I kind of knew that happened, but I wasn't aware of all of this other crazy shit that the Japanese were doing. From 1935 to 1945, prisoners were forced to infect themselves with syphilis. And even pregnant women were forcibly impregnated, and then they were infected with syphilis so that the babies would be born with congenital syphilis, and they could do research on how syphilis affects babies and how the disease affected an unborn fetus. So this brings us to another very morally corrupt syphilis study that took place, but this time it took place in America. The Tuskegee syphilis study took place in Tuskegee, Alabama during 1932 and 1997. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these. Despite the US forming the Nuremberg Code, which was supposed to provide protection for research participants, the code did not protect participants in the Tuskegee syphilis study. A study that was only supposed to last for 6 months ended up lasting for nearly 4 decades. The Public Health Service ended up deceiving 600 black men. They injected 399 men with syphilis and left 201 infection-free. They promised these men free healthcare, and while they did receive free healthcare and free mental health care that they normally wouldn't be able to obtain, they were deceived by the fact that they had no idea that they were being injected with syphilis. Men were only provided with ineffective procedures as treatment for what they called bad blood. Even after funding for this experiment was cut, the experiment continued on. However, the men were not told that they never receive a cure for what has been done to them. So despite the fact that in 1947, the penicillin drug was widely available to treat syphilis everywhere, these men who took part in the Tuskegee syphilis study were never given penicillin to treat syphilis. Again, they had no idea that they even had syphilis. They were deceived by public health safety. So finally in 1972, the immoral study was leaked to the press, and the study was terminated November 16th of that same year. 100 died from complications of syphilis. 40 of the men's wives were infected with syphilis. 28 patients died from syphilis, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis as a result of this experiment. Syphilis is still running rampant today. In 2019 alone, 130,000 cases of syphilis were reported, and that's a 70% increase from 2015. So the moral of the story being, wrap it the fuck up and choose your sexual partners wisely. And don't you be afraid to have a look down there and make sure who you finna fuck is clean and don't got no weird sores on them. So syphilis, with it having a history of being associated with the unclean and the promiscuous and the morally bankrupt, it literally affects everybody. It's not gonna pick and choose who it decides to fuck with. If you fuck somebody with syphilis, you're probably gonna get syphilis. No one's exempt from syphilis. Rich people, the nasty rich people especially, get syphilis. Poor people get syphilis. The working class get syphilis. We all get syphilis, okay? If you're a young person and you happen to have stumbled across this video, I'm letting you know now that most health clinics in your area will more than likely provide you with a bag of condoms for free. You don't have to go to Walmart and steal them. So please, all my young kings and queens, wrap that shit up and be really picky about who you're fucking. Please use protection. Please get yourself tested. Syphilis is one of the more disgusting STDs, but it's definitely not the only STD you can get. Herpes is another STD that you can get, and that one doesn't have a cure for it. That one you're just gonna have to struggle bust through for the rest of your life. Chlamydia is a really dangerous one for women especially, because if you get chlamydia, don't know you have chlamydia, and you don't get treated for it, it can damage your reproductive organs. And if you're somebody who wants to have children in the future, that really is gonna suck. So please guys, everybody, young kings and queens, middle-aged kings and queens, everybody watching this video, wrap that shit up and get tested. Now that I've scared you all into abstinence, my name is Trinity. Thank you for joining me on this little journey, and I will see you next time.